A Treatise on Government written by Aristotle. Translated from the Greek of Aristotle by William Ellis. Book 1. Chapter 1. As we see that every city is a society, and every society edition is established for some good purpose. For an apparent good is the spring of all human actions, it is evident that this is the principle upon which they are every one founded. And this is more especially true of that which has for its object the best possible, and is itself the most excellent. And comprehends all the are established now. This is called a city, and the society thereof a political society. For those who think that the principles of a political, a regal, a family, and a herald government are the same are mistaken. While they suppose that each of these differ in the numbers to whom their power extends, but not in their constitution. So that with them a herald government is one composed of a very few, a domestic of more, a civil and a regal of still more. As if there was no difference between a large family and a small city, or that a regal government and a political one are the same. Only that in the one a single person is continually at the head of public affairs, in the other, that each member of the state has in his turn a share in the government. And is at one time a magistrate, at another a private person, according to the rules of political science. But now this is not true, as will be evident to any one who will consider this question in the most approved method. Chapter 2. Now if in this particular science any one would attend to its original seeds, and their first shoot, he would then as in others have the subject perfectly before him. And perceive, in the first place, that it is requisite that those should be joined together whose species cannot exist without each other. As the male and the female, for the business of propagation, and this not through choice, but by that natural impulse which acts both upon plants and animals also. For the purpose of their leaving behind them others like themselves. It is also from natural causes that some beings command and others obey, that each may obtain their mutual safety. For a being who is endowed with a mind capable of reflection and forethought is by nature the superior and governor. Whereas he whose excellence is merely corporeal is foremeant to be a slave, whence it follows that the different state of master and slave is equally advantageous to both. But there is a natural difference between a female and a slave, for nature is not like the artists who make the Delphic swords for the use of the poor. But for every particular purpose she has her separate instruments, and thus her ends are most complete. For whatsoever is employed on one subject only, brings that one to much greater perfection than when employed on many. And yet among the barbarians, a female and a slave are upon a level in the community, the reason for which is that amongst them there are none qualified by nature to govern, therefore their society can be nothing but between slaves of different sexes. For which reason the poets say, it is proper for the Greeks to govern the barbarians, as if a barbarian and a slave were by nature one. Now of these two societies the domestic is the first, and Hesiod is right when he says, first a house, then a wife, then an ox for the plough, for the poor man has always an ox before a household. SL Avenue. That society then which nature has established for daily support is the domestic. And those who compose it are called by Charondas homosipui, and by Epimenides the Cretan homokapnoi. But the society of many families, which was first instituted for their lasting, mutual advantage, is called a village. And a village is most naturally composed of the descendants of one family, whom some persons call homogalacts. The children and the children's children thereof, for which reason cities were originally governed by kings. As the barbarian states now are, which are composed of those who had before submitted to kingly government. For every family is governed by the elder, as are the branches thereof, on account of their relationship thereunto. Which is what Homer says, each one ruled his wife and child, and in this scattered manner they formerly live. Addition and the opinion which universally prevails, that the gods themselves are subject to kingly government, arises from hence, that all men formerly were. And many are so now, and as they imagine themselves to be made in the likeness of the gods, so they suppose their manner of life must needs be the same. And when many villages so entirely join themselves together as in every respect to form but one society, that society is a city, and contains in itself, if I may so speak, the end and perfection of government. First founded that we might live, but continued that we may live happily. For which reason every city must be allowed to be the work of nature, if we admit that the original society between male and female is. For to this as their end all subordinate societies tend, and the end of everything is the nature of it. For what every being is in its most perfect state, that certainly is the nature of that being, whether it be a man, a horse, or a house. Besides, whatsoever produces the final cause and the end which we desire, must be best. But a government complete in itself is that final cause and what is be established. Hence it is evident that a city is a natural production, and that man is naturally a political animal, and that whosoever is naturally and not accidentally unfit for society, must be either inferior or superior to man. Thus the man in Homer, who is reviled for being, without society, without law, without family, such a one must naturally be of a quarrelsome disposition, and as solitary as the birds. The gift of speech also evidently proves that man is a more social animal than the bees, or any of the herding cattle. For nature, as we say, does nothing in vain, and man is the only animal who enjoys it. Voice indeed, as being the token of pleasure and pain, is imparted to others also, and thus much their nature is capable of. To perceive pleasure and pain, and to impart these sensations to others, but it is by speech that we are enabled to express what is useful for us, and what is hurtful, and of course what is just and what is unjust, for in this particular man differs from other animals, that he alone has a perception of good and evil, of just and unjust, and it is a participation of these common sentiments which forms a family and a city. Besides, the notion of a city naturally precedes that of a family or an individual, for the whole must necessarily be prior to the parts. For if you take away the whole man, you cannot say a foot or a hand remains, unless by equivocation. As supposing a hand of stone to be made, but that would only be a dead one, but everything is understood to be this or that by its energic qualities and powers. So that when these no longer remain, neither can that be said to be the same, but something of the same name. That a city then precedes an individual is plain, for if an individual is not in himself sufficient to compose a perfect government, he is to a city as other parts are to a whole, but he that is incapable of society, or so complete in himself as not to want it, makes no part of a city, as a beast or a god. There is then in all persons a natural impetus to associate with each other in this manner, and he who first founded civil society was the cause of the greatest good. For as by the completion of it man is the most excellent of all living beings, so without law and justice he would be the worst of all. For nothing is so difficult to subdue as injustice in arms, but these arms man is born with, namely, prudence and valor, which he may apply to the most opposite purposes, for he who abuses them will be the most wicked, the most cruel, the most lustful, and most gluttonous being imaginable, for justice is a political virtue. By the rules of it the state is regulated, and these rules are the criterion of what is right. Chapter 3. Since it is now evident of what parts a city is composed, it will be necessary to treat first of family government. For every city is made up of families, and every family has again its separate parts of which it is composition when a family is complete. It consists of freemen and slaves, but as in every subject we should begin with examining into the smallest parts of which it consists. And as the first and smallest parts of a family are the master and slave, the husband and wife, the father and child, let us first inquire into these three, what each of them may be, and what they ought to be, that is to say, the heral, the nuptial, and the paternal. Let these then be considered as the three distinct parts of a family. Some think that the providing what is necessary for the family is something different from the government of it. Others that this is the greatest part of it. It shall be considered separately, but we will first speak of a master and a slave, that we may both understand the nature of those things which are absolutely necessary, and also try if we can learn anything better on this subject than what is already known. Some persons have thought that the power of the master over his slave originates from his superior knowledge, and that this knowledge is the same in the master, the magistrate, and the king, as we have already said. But others think that heral government is contrary to nature, and that it is the law which makes one man a slave and another free. But that in nature there is no difference, for which reason that power cannot be founded in justice, but in force. Chapter 4. Since then a subsistence is necessary in every family, the means of procuring it certainly makes up part of the management of a family. For without necessaries it is impossible to live, and to live well. As in all arts which are brought to perfection, it is necessary that they should have their proper instruments if they would complete their works. So is it in the art of managing a family. Now of instruments some of them are alive, others inanimate. Thus with respect to the pilot of the ship, the tiller is without life, the sailor is alive, for a servant is as an instrument in many arts. Thus property is as an instrument to living, an estate is a multitude of instruments, so a slave is an animated instrument. But every one that can minister of himself is more valuable than any other instrument, for if every instrument, at command, or from a preconception of its master's will, could accomplish its work. As the story goes of the statues of Daedalus, or what the poet tells us of the tripods of Vulcan, that they moved of their own accord into the assembly of the gods. The shuttle would then weave, and the lyre play of itself, nor would the architect want servants, or the master slaves. Now what are generally called instruments are the efficients of something else, but possessions are what we simply use. Thus with a shuttle we make something else for our use, but we only use a coat, or a bed, since then making and using differ from each other in species, and they both require their instruments. It is necessary that these should be different from each other. Now life is itself what we use, and not what we employ as the efficient of something else, for which reason the services of a slave are for use. A possession may be considered in the same nature as a part of anything. Now a part is not only a part of something, but also is nothing else, so is a possession. Therefore a master is only the master of the slave, but no part of him. But the slave is not only the slave of the master, but nothing else but that. This fully explains what is the nature of a slave, and what are his capacities, for that being who by nature is nothing of himself, but totally another's, and is a man, is a slave by nature, and that man who is the property of another is his mere chattel, though he continues a man, but a chattel is an instrument for use, separate from the body. Chapter 5. But whether any person is such by nature, and whether it is advantageous and just for any one to be a slave or no, or whether all slavery is contrary to nature, shall be considered hereafter, not that it is difficult to determine it upon general principles, or to understand it from matters of fact, for that some should govern, and others be governed, is not only necessary but useful. And from the hour of their birth some are marked out for those purposes, and others for the other, and there are many species of both sorts. And the better those are who are governed, the better also is the government, as for instance of man, rather than the brute creation. For the more excellent the materials are with which the work is finished, the more excellent certainly is the work. And wherever there is a governor and a governed, there certainly is some work produced, for whatsoever is composed of many parts, which jointly become one, whether conjunct or separate, evidently show the marks of governing and governed. And this is true of every living thing in all nature, nay, even in some things which partake not of life. As in music, but this probably would be a disquisition too foreign to our present purpose. Every living thing in the first place is composed of soul and body, of these the one is by nature the governor, the other the governed. Now if we would know what is natural, we ought to search for it in those subjects in which nature appears most perfect, and not in those which are corrupted. We should therefore examine into a man who is most perfectly formed both in soul and body. In whom this is evident, for in the depraved and vicious the body seems to rule rather than the soul, on account of their being corrupt and contrary to nature. We may then, as we affirm, perceive in an animal the first principles of moral and political government. For the soul governs the body as the master governs his slave, the mind governs the appetite with a political or a kingly power. Which shows that it is both natural and advantageous that the body should be governed by the soul, and the pathetic part by the mind. And that part which is possessed of reason, but to have no ruling power, or an improper one, is hurtful to all. And this holds true not only of man, but of other animals also, for tame animals are naturally better than wild ones. And it is advantageous that both should be under subjection to man, for this is productive of their common safety. So is it naturally with the male and the female, the one is superior, the other inferior, the one governs, the other is governed, and the same rule must necessarily hold good with respect to all mankind. Those men therefore who are as much inferior to others as the body is to the soul, are to be thus disposed of. As the proper use of them is their bodies, in which their excellence consists, and if what I have said be true, they are slaves by nature, and it is advantageous to them to be always under government. He then is by nature formed a slave who is qualified to become the chattel of another person, and on that account is so. And who has just reason enough to know that there is such a faculty, without being endued with the use of it. For other animals have no perception of reason, but are entirely guided by appetite, and indeed they vary very little in their use from each other. For the advantage which we receive, both from slaves and tame animals, arises from their bodily strength administering to our necessities. For it is the intention of nature to make the bodies of slaves and freemen different from each other. That the one should be robust for their necessary purposes, the others erect, useless indeed for what slaves are employed in, but fit for civil life, which is divided into the duties of war and peace, though these rules do not always take place. For slaves have sometimes the bodies of freemen, sometimes the souls. If then it is evident that if some bodies are as much more excellent than others as the statues of the gods excel the human form, every one will allow that the inferior ought to be slaves to the superior, and if this is true with respect to the body, it is still juster to determine in the same manner, when we consider the soul, though it is not so easy to perceive the beauty of the soul as it is of the body. Chapter 6. But it is not difficult to perceive that those who maintain the contrary opinion have some reason on their side. For a man may become a slave two different ways, for he may be so by law also, and this law is a certain compact, by which whatsoever is taken in battle is adjudged to be the property of the conquerors, but many persons who are conversant in law call in question this pretended right, and say that it would be hard that a man should be compelled by violence to be the slave and subject of another who had the power to compel him, and was his superior in strength, and upon this subject, even of those who are wise, some think one way and some another. But the cause of this doubt and variety of opinions arises from hence, that great abilities, when accompanied with proper means, are generally able to succeed by force, for victory is always owing to a superiority in some advantageous circumstances. So that it seems that force never prevails but in consequence of great abilities. But still the dispute concerning the justice of it remains, for some persons think, that justice consists in benevolence, Others think it just that the powerful should govern. In the midst of these contrary opinions, there are no reasons sufficient to convince us that the right of being master and governor ought not to be placed with those who have the greatest abilities. Some persons, entirely resting upon the right which the law gives, for that which is legal is in some respects just, insist upon it that slavery occasioned by war is just, not that they say it is wholly so, for it may happen that the principle upon which the wars were commenced is unjust. Moreover, no one will say that a man who is unworthily in slavery is therefore a slave, for if so, men of the noblest families might happen to be slaves. And the descendants of slaves, if they should chance to be taken prisoners in war and sold, to avoid this difficulty they say that such persons should not be called slaves. But barbarians only should, but when they say this, they do nothing more than inquire who is a slave by nature. Which was what we at first said, for we must acknowledge that there are some persons who, wherever they are, must necessarily be slaves, but others in no situation. Thus also it is with those of noble descent. It is not only in their own country that they are esteemed as such, but everywhere, but the barbarians are respected on this account at home only. As if nobility and freedom were of two sorts, the one universal, the other not so. Thus says the Helen of Theodectes. Who dares reproach me with the name of slave? When from the immortal gods, on either side, I draw my lineage. Those who express sentiments like these, shew only that they distinguish the slave and the freeman, the noble and the ignoble from each other, by their virtues and their vices. For they think it reasonable, that as a man begets a man, and a beast, so from a good man should be descended. And this is what nature desires to do, but frequently cannot accomplish it. It is evident then that this doubt has some reason in it, and that these persons are not slaves, and those freemen, by the appointment of nature, and also that in some instances it is sufficiently clear, that it is advantageous to both parties for this man to be a slave, and that to be a master, and that it is right and just, that some should be governed, and others govern, in the manner that nature intended, of which sort of government is that which a master exercises over a sl avenue, but to govern ill is disadvantageous to both. For the same thing is useful to the part and to the whole, to the body and to the soul, but the slave is as it were a part of the master, as if he were an animated part of his body, though separate. Chapter 7. It is evident from what has been said, that a herald and a political government are not the same, or that all governments are alike to each other. As some affirm, for one is adapted to the nature of freemen, the other to that of slaves. Domestic government is a monarchy, for that is what prevails in every house, but a political state is the government of free men and equals. The master is not so called from his knowing how to manage his slave, but because he is so, for the same reason a slave and a freeman have their respective appellations. There is also one sort of knowledge proper for a master, another for a slave. The slave's is of the nature of that which was taught by a slave at Syracuse. For he for a stipulated sum instructed the boys in all the business of a household slave, of which there are various sorts to be learnt, as the art of cookery, and other such like services, of which some are allotted to some, and others to others. Some employments being more honorable, others more necessary, according to the proverb, one slave excels another, one master excels another. In such like things the knowledge of a slave consistens the knowledge of the master is to be able properly to employ his slaves. For the mastership of slaves is the employment, not the mere possession of them, not that this knowledge contains anything great or respectable. For what a slave ought to know how to do, that a master ought to know how to order, for which reason those who have it in their power to be free from these low attentions, employ a steward for this business, and apply themselves either to public affairs or philosophy, the knowledge of procuring what is necessary for a family is different from that which belongs either to the master or the slave. And to do this justly must be either by war or hunting. Chapter 8. As a slave is a particular species of property, let us by all means inquire into the nature of property in general. And the acquisition of money, according to the manner we have proposition in the first place then. Some one may doubt whether the getting of money is the same thing as economy, or whether it is a part of it, or something subservient to it, and if so, whether it is as the art of making shuttles is to the art of weaving, or the art of making brass to that of statue founding, for they are not of the same service, for the one supplies the tools, the other the matter. By the matter I mean the subject out of which the work is finished, as wool for the cloth and brass for the statue. It is evident then that the getting of money is not the same thing as economy, for the business of the one is to furnish the means of the other to use them. And what art is there employed in the management of a family but economy, but whether this is a part of it, or something of a different species, is a doubt, for if it is the business of him who is to get money to find out how riches and possessions may be procured, and both these arise from various causes, we must first inquire whether the art of husbandry is part of money-getting or something different. And in general, whether the same is not true of every acquisition and every attention which relates to provision. But as there are many sorts of provision, so are the methods of living both of man and the brute creation very various. And as it is impossible to live without food, the difference in that particular makes the lives of animals so different from each other. Of beasts, some live in herds, others separate, as is most convenient for procuring themselves food, as some of them live upon flesh, others on fruit, and others on whatsoever they light on, nature having so distinguished their course of life, that they can very easily procure themselves subsistence, and as the same things are not agreeable to all, but one animal likes one thing and another, it follows that the lives of those beasts who live upon flesh must be different from the lives of those who live on fruits. So is it with men, their lives differ greatly from each other, and of all these the shepherd's is the idlest. For they live upon the flesh of tame animals, without any trouble, while they are obliged to change their habitations on account of their flocks, which they are compelled to follow, cultivating, as it were, a living room. Others live exercising violence over living creatures, one pursuing this thing, another that, these preying upon men, those who live near lakes and marshes and rivers, or the sea itself, on fishing, while others are fowlers, or hunters of wild beasts, but the greater part of mankind live upon the produce of the earth and its cultivated fruits. And the manner in which all those live who follow the direction of nature, and labor for their own subsistence, is nearly the same, without ever thinking to procure any provision by way of exchange or merchandise. Such are shepherds, husbandmen, robbers, fishermen, and hunters, some join different employments together, and thus live very agreeably, supplying those deficiencies which were wanting to make their subsistence depend upon themselves only. Thus, for instance, the same person shall be a shepherd and a robber, or a husbandman and a hunter, and so with respect to the rest. They pursue that mode of life which necessity points out. This provision then nature herself seems to have furnished all animals with, as well immediately upon their first origin as also when they are arrived at a state of maturity. For at the first of these periods some of them are provided in the womb with proper nourishment, which continues till that which is born can get food for itself. As is the case with worms and birds, and as to those which bring forth their young alive, they have the means for their subsistence for a certain time within themselves, namely milk. It is evident then that we may conclude of those things that plants are created for the sake of animals, and animals for the sake of men, the tame for our use and provision, the wild, at least the greater part, for our provision also, or for some other advantageous purpose, as furnishing us with clothes, and the like. As nature therefore makes nothing either imperfect or in vain, it necessarily follows that she has made all these things for men. For which reason what we gain in war is in a certain degree a natural acquisition, for hunting is a part of it, which it is necessary for us to employ against wild beasts, and those men who being intended by nature for slavery are unwilling to submit to it. On which occasion such a war is by nature just, that species of acquisition then only which is according to nature is part of economy. And this ought to be at hand, or if not, immediately procured, namely, what is necessary to be kept in store to live upon, and which are useful as well for the state as the family. For they may be fixed as in other arts, for the instruments of no art whatsoever are infinite, either in their number or their magnitude. But riches are a number of instruments in domestic and civil economy. It is therefore evident that the acquisition of certain things according to nature is a part both of domestic and civil economy. And for what reason? Chapter 9. There is also another species of acquisition which they particularly call pecuniary, and with great propriety, and by this indeed it seems that there are no bounds to riches and wealth. Now many persons suppose, from their near relation to each other, that this is one and the same with that we have just mentioned. But it is not the same as that, though not very different. One of these is natural, the other is not. But rather owing to some art and skill, we will enter into a particular examination of this subject. The uses of every possession are two, both dependent upon the thing itself, but not in the same manner. The one supposing an inseparable connection with it, the other not, as a shoe, for instance, which may be either worn or exchanged for something else. Both these are the uses of the shoe, for he who exchanges a shoe with some man who wants one for money or provisions, uses the shoe as a shoe, but not according to the original intention, for shoes were not at first made to be exchanged. The same thing holds true of all other possessions. For barter, in general, had its original beginning in nature, some men having a surplus, others too little of what was necessary for them. Hence it is evident, that the selling provisions for money is not according to the natural use of things. For they were obliged to use barter for those things which they wanted, but it is plain that barter could have no place in the first. That is to say, in family society, but must have begun when the number of those who composed the community was enlarged. For the first of these had all things in common. But when they came to be separated they were obliged to exchange with each other many different things which both parties want. Addition which custom of barter is still preserved amongst many barbarous nations, who procure one necessary with another, but never sell anything, as giving and receiving wine for corn and the like. This sort of barter is not contradictory to nature, nor is it any species of money-getting, but is necessary in procuring that subsistence which is so consonant thereunto. But this barter introduced the use of money, as might be expected, for a convenient place from whence to import what you wanted, or to export what you had a surplus of. Being often at a great distance, money necessarily made its way into commerce. For it is not everything which is naturally most useful that is easiest of carriage, for which reason they invented something to exchange with each other which they should mutually give and take. That being really valuable itself, should have the additional advantage of being of easy conveyance. For the purposes of life, as iron and silver, or anything else of the same nature, and this at first passed in value simply according to its weight or size. But in process of time it had a certain stamp, to save the trouble of weighing, which stamp expressed its value. Money then being established as the necessary medium of exchange, another species of money-getting soon took place. Namely, by buying and selling, at probably first in a simple manner, afterwards with more skill and experience. Where and how the greatest profits might be made. For which reason the art of money-getting seems to be chiefly conversant about trade, and the business of it to be able to tell where the greatest profits can be made. Being the means of procuring abundance of wealth and possessions, and thus wealth is very often supposed to consist in the quantity of money which any one possesses. As this is the medium by which all trade is conducted and a fortune made, others again regard it as of no value. As being of none by nature, but arbitrarily made so by compact, so that if those who use it should alter their sentiments, it would be worth nothing, as being of no service for any necessary purpose. Besides, he who abounds in money often wants necessary food, and it is impossible to say that any person is in good circumstances when with all his possessions he may perish with hunger. Like Midas in the fable, who from his insatiable wish had everything he touched turned into gold. For which reason others endeavor to procure other riches and other property, and rightly, for there are other riches and property in nature. And these are the proper objects of economy, while trade only procures money, not by all means, but by the exchange of it. And for that purpose it is this which it is chiefly employed about, for money is the first principle and the end of trade. Nor are there any bounds to be set to what is thereby acquired. Thus also there are no limits to the art of medicine. With respect to the health which it attempts to procure, the same also is true of all other arts, no line can be drawn to terminate their bounds, the several professors of them being desirous to extend them as far as possible. But still the means to be employed for that purpose are limited, and these are the limits beyond which the art cannot proceed. Thus in the art of acquiring riches there are no limits. For the object of that is money and possessions, but economy has a boundary, though this has not, for acquiring riches is not the business of that. For which reason it should seem that some boundary should be set to riches, though we see the contrary to this is what is practiced. For all those who get riches add to their money without end, the cause of which is the near connection of these two arts with each other, which sometimes occasions the one to change employments with the other, as getting of money is their common object. For economy requires the possession of wealth, but not on its own account but with another view, to purchase things necessary therewith. But the other procures it merely to increase it, so that some persons are confirmed in their belief that this is the proper object of economy, and think that for this purpose money should be saved and hoarded up without end. The reason for which disposition is, that they are intent upon living, but not upon living well, and this desire being boundless in its extent. The means which they aim at for that purpose are boundless also, and those who propose to live well often confine that to the enjoyment of the pleasures of sense, so that as this also seems to depend upon what a man has, all their care is to get money, and hence arises the other cause for this art, for as this enjoyment is excessive in its degree, they endeavor to procure means proportionate to supply it, and if they cannot do this merely by the art of dealing in money, they will endeavor to do it by other ways, and apply all their powers to a purpose they were not by nature intended for. Thus, for instance, courage was intended to inspire fortitude, not to get money by, neither is this the end of the soldier's or the physician's art, but victory and health. But such persons make everything subservient to money getting, as if this was the only end, and to the end everything ought to refer. We have now considered that art of money getting which is not necessary, and have seen in what manner we became in want of it. And also that which is necessary, which is different from it, for that economy which is natural, and whose object is to provide food, is not like this unlimited in its extent, but has its bounds. Chapter 10. We have now determined what was before doubtful, whether or no the art of getting money is his business who is at the head of a family or a state. And though not strictly so, it is however very necessary, for as a politician does not make men, but receiving them from the hand of nature employs them to proper purposes. Thus the earth, or the sea, or something else ought to supply them with provisions, and this it is the business of the master of the family to manage properly. For it is not the weaver's business to make yarn, but to use it, and to distinguish what is good and useful from what is bad and of no service. And indeed some one may inquire why getting money should be a part of economy when the art of healing is not. As it is as requisite that the family should be in health as that they should eat, or have anything else which is necessary. And as it is indeed in some particulars the business both of the master of the family, and he to whom the government of the state is entrusted, to see after the health of those under their care, but in others not, but the physicians, so also as to money. In some respects it is the business of the master of the family, in others not, but of the servant, but as we have already said, it is chiefly nature's, for it is her part to supply her offspring with food, for everything finds nourishment left for it in what produced it. For which reason the natural riches of all men arise from fruits and animals. Now money-making, as we say, being twofold, it may be applied to two purposes, the service of the house or retail trade, of which the first is necessary and commendable, the other justly censurable, for it has not its origin in nature. But by it men gain from each other, for usury is most reasonably detested, as it is increasing our fortune. By money itself, and not employing it for the purpose it was originally intended, namely exchange. And this is the explanation of the name, tokos, which means the breeding of money. For as offspring resemble their parents, so usury is money bred of money. Whence of all forms of money-making it is most against nature. Chapter 11. Having already sufficiently considered the general principles of this subject, let us now go into the practical part thereof. The one is a liberal employment for the mind, the other necessary. These things are useful in the management of one's affairs, to be skillful in the nature of cattle, which are most profitable. And where, and how, as for instance, what advantage will arise from keeping horses, or oxen, or sheep, or any other livestock, it is also necessary to be acquainted with the comparative value of these things. And which of them in particular places are worth most, for some do better in one place, some in another. Agriculture also should be understood, and the management of arable grounds and orchards, and also the care of bees, and fish, and birds, from whence any profit may arise. These are the first and most proper parts of domestic management. With respect to gaining money by exchange, the principal method of doing this is by merchandise, which is carried on in three different ways. Either by sending the commodity for sale by sea or by land, or else selling it on the place where it grows. And these differ from each other in this, that the one is more profitable, the other safer. The second method is by usury. The third by receiving wages for work done, and this either by being employed in some mean art, or else in mere bodily labor. There is also a third species of improving a fortune, that is something between this and the first, for it partly depends upon nature, partly upon exchange, the subject of which is, things that are immediately from the earth, or their produce, which, though they bear no fruit, are yet useful, such as selling of timber and the whole art of metallurgy, which includes many different species, for there are various sorts of things dug out of the earth. These we have now mentioned in general, but to enter into particulars concerning each of them, though it might be useful to the artist, would be tiresome to dwell on. Now of all the works of art, those are the most excellent wherein chance has the least to do, and those are the meanest which deprave the body. Those the most servile in which bodily strength alone is chiefly wanted, those most illiberal which require least skill. But as there are books written on these subjects by some persons, as by Chares the Panian, and Apollodorus the Lemnian, upon husbandry and planting, and by others on other matters, let those who have occasion consult them thereon. Besides, every person should collect together whatsoever he hears occasionally mentioned, by means of which many of those who aimed at making a fortune have succeeded in their intentions. For all these are useful to those who make a point of getting money, as in the contrivance of Thales the Milesian, which was certainly a gainful one. But as it was his, it was attributed to his wisdom, though the method he used was a general one, and would universally succeed. When they reviled him for his poverty, as if the study of philosophy was useless, for they say that he, perceiving by his skill in astrology that there would be great plenty of olives that year, while it was yet winter, having got a little money, he gave earnest for all the oil works that were in Miletus and Chios, which he hired at a low price. There being no one to bid against him, but when the season came for making oil, many persons wanting them, he all at once let them upon what terms he pleased, and raising a large sum of money by that means, convinced them that it was easy for philosophers to be rich if they chose it. But that was not what they aimed at. In this manner is Thales said to have shown his wisdom. It indeed is, as we have said, generally gainful for a person to contrive to make a monopoly of anything. For which reason some cities also take this method when they want money, and monopolize their commodities. There was a certain person in Sicily who laid out a sum of money which was deposited in his hand in buying up all the iron from the iron merchants. So that when the dealers came from the markets to purchase, there was no one had any to sell but himself. And though he put no great advance upon it, yet by laying out 50 talents he made an 100. When Dionysius heard this, he permitted him to take his money with him, but forbid him to continue any longer in Sicily, as being one who contrived means for getting money inconsistent with his affairs. This man's view and Thales's was exactly the same. Both of them contrived to procure a monopoly for themselves. It is useful also for politicians to understand these things, for many states want to raise money and by such means, as well as private families, nay more so, for which reason some persons who are employed in the management of public affairs confine themselves to this province only. Chapter 12. There are then three parts of domestic government: the masters, of which we have already treated, the fathers, and the husbands. Now the government of the wife and children should both be that of free persons, but not the same. For the wife should be treated as a citizen of a free state, the children should be under kingly power. For the male is by nature superior to the female, except when something happens contrary to the usual course of nature, as is the elder and perfect to the younger and imperfect. Now in the generality of free states, the governors and the governed alternately change place, for an equality without any preference is what nature chooses. However, when one governs and another is governed, she endeavors that there should be a distinction between them in forms, expressions, and honors, according to what Amasis said of his labor. This then should be the established rule between the man and the woman. The government of children should be kingly, for the power of the father over the child is founded in affection and seniority, which is a species of kingly government, for which reason Homer very properly calls Jupiter, the father of gods and men, who was king of both these, for nature requires that a king should be of the same species with those whom he governs, though superior in some particulars, as is the case between the elder and the younger, the father and the son. Chapter 13. It is evident then that in the due government of a family, greater attention should be paid to the several members of it and their virtues than to the possessions or riches of it, and greater to the freemen than the slaves. But here some one may doubt whether there is any other virtue in a slave than his organic services, and of higher estimation than these, as temperance, fortitude, justice, and such like habits, or whether they possess only bodily qualities. Each side of the question has its difficulties, for if they possess these virtues, wherein do they differ from freemen? And that they do not, since they are men, and partakers of reason, is absurd. Nearly the same inquiry may be made concerning a woman and a child, whether these also have their proper virtues. Whether a woman ought to be temperate, brave, and just, and whether a child is temperate or no, and indeed this inquiry ought to be general. Whether the virtues of those who, by nature, either govern or are governed, are the same or different. For if it is necessary that both of them should partake of the fair and good, why is it also necessary that, without exception, the one should govern, the other always be governed? For this cannot arise from their possessing these qualities in different degrees, for to govern, and to be governed, are things different in species, but more or less are not. And yet it is wonderful that one party ought to have them, and the other not, for if he who is to govern should not be temperate and just, how can he govern well? Or if he is to be governed, how can he be governed well? For he who is intemperate and a coward will never do what he ought. It is evident then that both parties ought to be virtuous. But there is a difference between them, as there is between those who by nature command and who by nature obey. And this originates in the soul, for in this nature has planted the governing and submitting principle. The virtues of which we say are different, as are those of a rational and an irrational being. It is plain then that the same principle may be extended farther, and that there are in nature a variety of things which govern and are governed. For a freeman is governed in a different manner from a slave, a male from a female, and a man from a child. And all these have parts of mind within them, but in a different manner. Thus a slave can have no power of determination, a woman but a weak one, a child an imperfect one. Thus also must it necessarily be with respect to moral virtues, all must be supposed to possess them. But not in the same manner, but as is best suited to every one's employment, on which account he who is to govern ought to be perfect in moral virtue. For his business is entirely that of an architect, and reason is the architect, while others want only that portion of it which may be sufficient for their station. From whence it is evident, that although moral virtue is common to all those we have spoken of, yet the temperance of a man and a woman are not the same. Nor their courage, nor their justice, though Socrates thought otherwise, for the courage of the man consists in commanding, the woman's in obeying, and the same is true in other particulars, and this will be evident to those who will examine different virtues separately. For those who use general terms deceive themselves when they say, that virtue consists in a good disposition of mind, or doing what is right, or something of this sort. Silence is a woman's ornament. But it is not a man's, and as a child is incomplete, it is evident that his virtue is not to be referred to himself in his present situation, but to that in which he will be complete, and his preceptor. In like manner the virtue of a slave is to be referred to his master, for we laid it down as a maxim, that the use of a slave was to employ him in what you wanted, so that it is clear enough that few virtues are wanted in his station. Only that he may not neglect his work through idleness or fear, some person may question if what I have said is true. Whether virtue is not necessary for artificers in their calling, for they often through idleness neglect their work. But the difference between them is very great, for a slave is connected with you for life, but the artificer not so nearly. As near therefore as the artificer approaches to the situation of a slave, just so much ought he to have of the virtues of one. For a mean artificer is to a certain point a slave, but then a slave is one of those things which are by nature what they are. But this is not true of a shoemaker, or any other arty saint. It is evident then that a slave ought to be trained to those virtues which are proper for his situation by his master, and not by him who has the power of a master, to teach him any particular art. Those therefore are in the wrong who would deprive slaves of reason, and say that they have only to follow their orders. For slaves want more instruction than children, and thus we determine this matter. It is necessary, I am sensible, for every one who treats upon government, to enter particularly into the relations of husband and wife, and of parent and child, and to show what are the virtues of each and their respective connections with each other, what is right and what is wrong, and how the one ought to be followed, and the other avoid addition, since then every family is part of a city, and each of those individuals is part of a family, and the virtue of the parts ought to correspond to the virtue of the whole. It is necessary, that both the wives and children of the community should be instructed correspondent to the nature thereof. If it is of consequence to the virtue of the state, that the wives and children therein should be virtuous. And of consequence it certainly is, for the wives are one half of the free persons, and of the children the succeeding citizens are to be form addition, as then we have determined these points. We will leave the rest to be spoken to in another place, as if the subject was now finished, and beginning again anew. First consider the sentiments of those who have treated of the most perfect forms of government.